The door exploded inward. One moment there was only the hush of a library at midnight, the soft hiss of a dying fire, the scent of leather and beeswax, and two people standing closer than Regency England would ever forgive. The next, the heavy oak door slammed against the wall with a crack like a pistol shot, and Mr. Thomas Vale, merchant, widower, father, stood framed in the doorway with a lantern raised in one trembling hand and murder in his eyes. Eleanor Vale did not move. She should have stepped back. She should have dropped her gaze, covered her mouth, invented some trembling lie about a misplaced shawl or a fainting spell. That is what a well-bred girl would have done. That is what survival demanded. But Eleanor did not step back, because the man standing before her, so close she could feel the warmth of his breath against her forehead, so close that the candle in his hand cast a single flickering shadow of them both upon the wall, as though they were already one silhouette, was Julian Ashford, the 9th Duke of Ashford, one of the 3 richest men in England, a man who could have any woman in the kingdom with the crook of a gloved finger. And he was looking at her like she was the only book in a library of 10,000. Eleanor? Her father's voice was a whisper that cut sharper than any shout. Step away from him. Now. The Duke did not release her hand. And in that frozen, terrible instant, as the clock on the mantel struck the quarter hour and the lantern light shook against the spines of 1,000 leather-bound books, Eleanor Vale understood that her entire life had just ended. What she did not yet understand was that it had also just begun. But to know how a merchant's daughter came to stand hand in hand with a duke at midnight in a forbidden library, to know how the scandal that would shake all of London began with a single stolen book, we have to go back. Just a fortnight, to the night Eleanor Vale first crossed a threshold she was never meant to cross. Welcome back to Moonlight at Mayfair. Settle in, dim the lamps, pour something warm. Tonight's story is called The Duke Who Dared, and I promise you, before the last candle gutters out, you will understand why London whispered her name for 50 years. Eleanor Vale was not supposed to be at Ashford House that night. She was not supposed to be at Ashford House any night, in point of fact. She was the daughter of a cloth merchant, a very successful cloth merchant, the sort who supplied the silk for half the gowns at Almack's, but a merchant nonetheless. The sort of man whose money was welcome in the great houses of Mayfair only so long as it arrived by the front ledger and never by the front door. But Eleanor's mother had been a governess before she married, and Eleanor's mother had believed, with the fierce and quiet conviction of a woman who had nothing else to leave her daughter, that a girl's mind was the one dowry no one could ever take from her. By the time she was 10, Eleanor had read Milton. By 12, she had read Mary Wollstonecraft in secret, the pages held close to a candle she should not have lit. By 19, she had read everything in her father's modest library twice over, and she was beginning to feel like a bird that had memorized every inch of its cage. Then, one bright October morning, a letter arrived inviting Mr. Vale to call upon the Duke of Ashford's estate manager to discuss a substantial standing order of velvet for the Duke's mother. And Mr. Vale, who had never in his life refused a profitable opportunity, and who had also never quite known what to do with a daughter who read Latin for pleasure, looked up from the letter and said the fatal words, "Eleanor, fetch your bonnet. You may as well see how the other half conducts their business." She would remember that sentence until the day she died. Ashford House was not a house. It was a civilization. Eleanor had seen great houses from the outside, every Londoner had, but nothing prepared her for the moment the butler led them through the marble entry hall and down a corridor so long it seemed to bend with the curvature of the earth. Her father was shown into the estate manager's office. Eleanor was shown, with a small bow and the faint, practised disdain of a man who had shown 100 daughters into 100 waiting rooms, into the blue drawing-room, and told she might make herself comfortable. She sat. For 9 minutes she sat. On the 10th minute she stood up. Because through the drawing-room doors, down a corridor lined with portraits of grim-faced ancestors, she had caught a glimpse of something that stopped her breath in her throat. A room. An enormous room. 2 stories tall, with a spiral staircase of wrought iron curling up toward a gallery. And books. Books from floor to ceiling. Books beyond counting. Books in a quantity she had not known existed in any single place in the world outside of heaven. The library of Ashford House was said to contain over 40,000 volumes, assembled by 7 generations of dukes who had more money than sense and more curiosity than scruples. And on that October afternoon, with her father safely occupied and the butler nowhere in sight, Eleanor Vale committed the first truly reckless act of her life. She walked into the Duke's library, uninvited, alone, and she began to read. She told herself she would only stay a moment. A moment became 10 minutes. 10 minutes became an hour. She moved along the shelves with her fingertips grazing the leather spines, her lips moving silently as she read the titles. Herodotus, Tacitus, Dante in the original Italian, a first folio Shakespeare she did not quite dare to touch. And then, on a high shelf in the eastern alcove, half hidden behind a bust of some forgotten Roman senator, she saw it. A small book, bound in dark green morocco. No title on the spine, no author's name. She should not have reached for it. She did. She opened the cover, and her breath stopped. The book was a collection of poems, handwritten, not printed. The ink was brown with age in some places, still sharp and black in others, as though the writer had added to it over many years. And the poems were not the sort one found in the drawing-rooms of Mayfair. They were not pretty verses about roses and shepherdesses and the gentle griefs of love. They were angry. They were honest. They were poems about a man who felt the weight of a great name pressing down upon him like a coffin lid. Poems about duty and loneliness and the terrible silence of rooms full of people who only saw his title. Poems about a cage made of gold. Eleanor sank into a velvet chair beside the dying fire, the book open in her lap, and she forgot entirely where she was. The hours passed. The light through the tall windows turned from gold to amber to blue to black. Somewhere in the distant house a clock struck 11. She did not hear it. A footman, passing the library door, glanced in and saw only an empty room. For Eleanor, curled in the great chair with the book, was quite hidden from the doorway. Her father, long since concluded with his business, had been told by an apologetic butler that Miss Vale had taken ill and been sent home in a hired carriage. A message, the butler assured him, that had already been dispatched. No such message existed. No such carriage had been summoned. It was the sort of small, efficient lie that great houses tell to move inconvenient people along. Mr. Vale, troubled but trusting, had gone home to wait for his daughter, and Eleanor read on. The clock struck midnight. And then, from the shadows at the far end of the library, a voice said, "You are reading my poems." Eleanor did not scream. She would wonder for years afterward why she did not scream. A strange man's voice at midnight, in a house where she did not belong, with a stolen book open in her lap. Any sensible girl would have screamed. But something in the voice stopped her. It was quiet. It was not angry. It was, and this was the most astonishing thing of all, it was curious. She looked up. He stepped into the circle of candlelight, and for the first time Eleanor Vale saw the Duke of Ashford. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30, no more. Tall and lean, with dark hair that needed cutting, and eyes the colour of rain on slate. He wore no coat. His cravat was loosened. He held a glass of brandy in one hand and a single taper in the other. And he was looking at her, at the book in her lap, at the tear-stained page she had been reading, at her face, with an expression she could not name. She should have stood. She should have curtsied. She should have stammered an apology and fled. Instead, she heard herself say, "They are very fine, Your Grace, but the 12th one is a lie." There was a long silence. The Duke set down his brandy, very slowly, very carefully, as though he were afraid any sudden movement might cause her to vanish. "The 12th?" he said. "The one about being grateful for the cage," she said. "You do not feel grateful. You wrote that one for someone else to read. It does not belong with the others." Another silence, longer this time. And then the Duke of Ashford, a man who, by all rights, should have called the footman, had her thrown into the street and perhaps prosecuted for trespass, did something no one had ever done in the history of Ashford House. He laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. It was the laugh of a man who has been holding his breath for a very long time and has suddenly, unexpectedly, been allowed to exhale. He crossed the library in 4 long strides and sank into the chair opposite hers, the candle still in his hand, and he looked at her as though she were a species of creature he had read about in books, but never expected to meet in the wild. "Tell me," he said. "Tell me which ones are the true ones." And Eleanor Vale, merchant's daughter, sitting at midnight in the library of the Duke of Ashford with a stolen book in her lap and no chaperone within a mile of her, began to talk. She talked for an hour. She should have been ruined 100 times over in that single conversation. But the footman had gone to bed. The butler was asleep. The housekeeper was visiting her sister in Kent. And the Duke, when Eleanor finally rose, pale with exhaustion and belatedly terrified, and asked if he might somehow call her a hackney, the Duke did something stranger still. He walked her to the servants' gate himself. He pressed a coin into the hand of the night watchman and gave him an address and an instruction to see her safely to her father's door. And as she stepped into the cold October night, he said, very quietly, "Miss Vale, if I were to send a book back to your father's shop, a volume he had perhaps inquired about, would you, do you think, be the one to open the parcel?" She understood him at once. God help her, she understood him at once. "Yes, Your Grace," she said, "I would." "Then I shall send you a book," he said, "tomorrow." The first book arrived the next afternoon. It was a battered volume of John Donne's sermons, of all things, the sort of book a gentleman might plausibly send to a cloth merchant for rebinding, for Mr. Vale's shop, among its other services, employed an excellent bookbinder on the ground floor. The parcel was addressed to Mr. Vale. The enclosed note, in a clerk's impersonal hand, requested a new binding in dark blue calfskin. Nothing in the parcel suggested anything untoward, except that when Eleanor opened it, for she had been oddly attentive to the post that afternoon, A single folded sheet of paper fell out from between the pages of the second chapter. It was not signed. It did not need to be. Miss V, I have been thinking all day about what you said of the 12th poem. You are right. I wrote it for my mother, who asked me once if I was happy, and to whom I could not bear to say no. I have never told anyone that. I do not know why I am telling you. Perhaps because you already knew. There is a poem by Donne on page 47 that I think you will like. It is about a compass. Tell me if I am wrong. Eleanor read the note 3 times. She held it over the candle flame for a full minute, hesitating, before she pressed it flat inside her own copy of Wollstonecraft and hid it beneath her mattress. Then she turned to page 47. She read the poem about the compass. She read it again. And then she sat down at her little writing desk, took out a sheet of her father's shop paper, and began to write. Your Grace, you are not wrong about the poem. You are, however, wrong about yourself. A man who can recognize the truth of a stiff twin compass is not a man who belongs in a cage. Cages are for creatures who cannot see the bars. You have been seeing them your whole life. The question is, what you intend to do about it. I shall return the book on Thursday, rebound as requested. Inside the back cover, you will find my answer to your poem about the cage. It is not a good answer, but it is an honest one, and I think you have not had very many of those lately. E.V. She folded the letter. She tucked it inside the back cover. She sent the book back on Thursday. And on Friday, another book arrived. For 14 days they wrote. Books came and went between Ashford House and the Vale Bookbindery with a frequency that, had anyone been watching, would have been suspicious in the extreme. Volumes of Plutarch, a battered edition of Marcus Aurelius, a small book of Persian poetry that had been translated badly by some 18th century Orientalist, and which the Duke confessed he was only sending because he wanted to know if Eleanor's translation was better. It was, by a great deal. Inside each book, a letter, and inside each letter, a little more of the truth. He wrote to her about his father, a man who had spent his life counting coins and measuring every smile for its cost, and who had died in a cold bed with no one holding his hand. He wrote to her about the great terror of his life, which was that he would become that man. He wrote to her about the women his mother kept inviting to dinner, each one more beautiful and more accomplished and more perfectly empty. He sent a book with no note inside it at all, only a single pressed flower, a sprig of rosemary for remembrance, and, on the end paper, in his own hand, the words, I must see you, tomorrow, midnight, the library. I do not know how else to say it. Come if you can. Burn this if you cannot. She did not burn it, and so, on the 14th night, Eleanor Vale did the second truly reckless thing of her life. She waited until her father was asleep. She wrapped herself in her mother's old grey cloak. She slipped out through the kitchen door, hired a hackney 2 streets over with the coin she had been saving for a new pair of boots, and rode through the dark streets of London to the servants' gate of Ashford House. He was waiting for her. He took her hand, the first time he had ever touched her, and led her through the silent corridors to the library. A single candle burned on the mantel. The fire had been lit and had nearly died. He had dismissed the servants for the night. They were, so far as the house knew, entirely alone. They did not kiss, not at first. They talked. They argued about Wordsworth. He showed her a map of the Mediterranean he had been keeping in a locked drawer and traced with his finger the route he had always meant to take and never had. She told him about her mother and cried a little, and was furious at herself for crying. He took her hand again and did not let it go. And then, very quietly, he said, "Eleanor, I have been a coward my entire life. I have been the duke my father wanted. I have never once been the man I wanted. And in 14 days, you have made me understand that I cannot go back to being either. I do not know what I am asking you. I do not know what I have the right to ask you. But I know that when I imagine any future that does not have you in it, I cannot breathe." She opened her mouth to answer, and the door exploded inward. We are back now, you see, to the moment we began with. The lantern, the shaking hand, the murder in Thomas Vale's eyes, the clock striking the quarter hour, the two silhouettes on the wall. What you did not know when we began was how Mr. Vale had come to be there. He had come because the butler's lie a fortnight ago had never quite sat right with him. He had come because Eleanor had been strange for 2 weeks, luminous, distracted, sleepless, and a father knows. He had come because that afternoon, searching her room for reasons he could not have named, he had found a letter hidden beneath her mattress, signed only A, written in a hand so educated and so unmistakably male that his blood had turned to ice. He had come because when, at 11 o'clock that night, he had gone to her room to demand an explanation, he had found it empty. And he had come because a father who has lost a wife will do anything, anything at all, to keep from losing a daughter. He had not known, when he pounded on the servants' gate of Ashford House and bribed the night watchman with every coin in his pocket, whether he would find his daughter inside or not. He had prayed not. He had prayed he was a madman and a fool. He had not been either. "Eleanor." His voice in the library doorway was the voice of a man whose heart was breaking in real time. "Step away from him, now!" She did not. She turned her face toward her father, and in the candlelight he saw, with a shock greater than any rage, that she was not ashamed. She was not afraid. She was something he had not seen in her since her mother's funeral. She was resolute. "Papa," she said, "this is the Duke of Ashford. He has asked nothing improper of me. I came here of my own will. I take the blame entirely." "You take the blame," her father repeated, as though the words were in a language he did not speak. "You take the blame. Eleanor, do you understand what this is? Do you understand what happens to a girl who is found at midnight in the library of a duke? Do you understand that by tomorrow morning every drawing room in London will know your name, and by tomorrow night no decent household will receive you, and by the end of the week every door in this city will be closed to you forever?" "Mr. Vale." The Duke's voice was quiet, but it carried. Thomas Vale turned, and for the first time, by the light of his own lantern, he saw the man who had, as he understood it, destroyed his daughter. He saw a duke in shirt-sleeves, without a coat, without a cravat properly tied, with a face that was not smirking or arrogant or ashamed, but something else entirely. Something Thomas Vale, who had spent 40 years reading men across a ledger, recognized instantly, and did not want to recognize. Julian Ashford stepped forward. He took Eleanor's hand again, openly this time, in full view of her father, and he said the words that would, within 48 hours, be repeated in every coffee house and every sitting room, from St. James's to Cheapside. "Mr. Vale, I was going to call upon you tomorrow morning, as is proper, to ask for your daughter's hand in marriage. I see now that I must ask you tonight instead. I love her. I have loved her for 14 days, and I expect to love her for every day that remains to me. I am aware that this is not how these things are done. I am aware that you have every reason to hate me. I am asking you anyway." The library was so silent that Eleanor could hear the candle gutter. Thomas Vale stared at the Duke. He stared at his daughter. He stared at the hand she had not taken back from the man who held it. And then, slowly, Mr. Vale, who had not wept in public since his wife's funeral, sat down in the nearest chair and put his face in his hands. "Oh, Eleanor," he said. "Oh, my clever, foolish girl. You have no idea what you have done." By sunrise, London knew. It is a peculiar feature of great cities that scandal moves faster than fire. By the time Eleanor returned to her father's house before dawn, accompanied by the Duke himself, who insisted upon walking her to her own door and damning any watchman who saw, a kitchen maid at Ashford House had already whispered to a cook, who had whispered to a fishmonger, who had whispered to a footman at Lord Carrington's, who had whispered to Lady Carrington's lady's maid, who had whispered to Lady Carrington herself over her morning chocolate. And Lady Carrington, who had 3 unmarried daughters and a long memory and a pen that moved faster than any horse, had sat down at her writing desk and begun composing notes. By noon, the story was in every drawing room in Mayfair. By 2, it had crossed into Bloomsbury. By 4, the more scandalous pamphleteers of Fleet Street were already setting type for the evening editions. The story they told was not quite the story that had happened. In the version that spread through London, Eleanor Vale was a scheming merchant's chit who had climbed through the Duke's window to trap him. Or she was an innocent village girl the Duke had lured to his library with promises of poetry. Or she was already his mistress and had been for months, and the meeting in the library was merely the assignation where his wickedness had finally been discovered. The details varied according to the teller. The moral did not. The moral was always the same. The Duke of Ashford has ruined a girl beneath his station, and the polite verdict, whispered behind fans in every respectable house in town, was this. The Duke would pay her father a handsome settlement. The girl would be sent to the country, perhaps to a distant cousin in Yorkshire, perhaps to a convent in France. The Duke would marry Lady Cassandra Beaumont, as his mother had long intended, within the year. And in 5 years, no one would remember Eleanor Vale's name. That is what polite London expected. Polite London had never met Julian Ashford. Not really. At 3 o'clock on the afternoon following the scandal, a crested carriage drew up in front of a modest brick house on a respectable but unfashionable street in Cheapside. Passers-by stopped and stared. Children pointed. A woman dropped her basket of apples and did not pick them up. The Duke of Ashford stepped down from the carriage. He was dressed, and the detail mattered, would matter for years in the tellings and retellings, not in the casual morning coat of a gentleman paying a reluctant social call, but in the full, formal dress of a duke presenting himself at the most important meeting of his life. He wore a dark blue coat with silver buttons. He wore his father's signet ring. He carried, in one gloved hand, a small bouquet of white roses and rosemary. He walked up to the front door of the Vale house. He knocked. Himself, with his own hand, while half of Cheapside watched. Thomas Vale opened the door. His eyes were red. He had not slept. Behind him, Eleanor stood on the stairs in a plain grey dress, her hair unbound, her face pale as paper. The Duke removed his hat. He bowed, not a shallow nobleman's nod, but a full, deep bow, the kind a man gives to someone he considers his equal. "Mr. Vale," he said, loud enough that the entire street could hear. Loud enough indeed that he clearly meant the entire street to hear. "I have come to ask formally for your daughter's hand in marriage. I am not here because of what was said in the newspapers this morning. I am not here to repair any reputation. I am here because Eleanor is the finest mind and the bravest heart I have ever encountered in my life, and because I would consider myself the luckiest man in England if she would consent to be my wife. I have come to ask her in your presence, as is proper, and I have come to ask you for your blessing, which I know I do not deserve, but which I am asking for anyway, because a marriage without a father's blessing is no marriage at all." He turned to Eleanor. In front of her father, in front of Cheapside, in front of, effectively, all of London. "Eleanor Vale, will you marry me?" She could not speak. She nodded. He handed her the roses, and then, because he was a duke and a man who had spent a fortnight writing letters in the backs of books to the woman he loved, and because he had decided at some point in the previous 12 hours that he was finished with caring what London thought of him, Julian Ashford took her hand in full view of the watching street and kissed it. The story, which had started that morning as a scandal about a ruined girl, took on by nightfall a very different shape. A duke, said London, who could have washed his hands of the whole affair, had instead walked into a tradesman's house in a plain street and asked humbly for the girl's hand. Not to silence the gossip, not to do the honourable thing, but, it was said, and it was believed, because the footman who had heard him had repeated every word, because he loved her. London did not know what to do with that. London had no category for it. London decided, cautiously, to wait and see. They were married 3 weeks later, not in St. George's, Hanover Square, where the great marriages of the ton were performed, not in the cathedral-sized chapel at the Duke's ancestral seat with 500 guests and a choir from the Chapel Royal, but in a small parish church in Kent, on a bright, cold November morning, with no guests at all save Eleanor's father, the Duke's elderly aunt, who had cried quietly throughout the service and would become, in the years that followed, Eleanor's fiercest ally, and 2 farmhands pressed into service as witnesses. Eleanor wore a simple cream gown she had sewn partly herself. She carried rosemary. The Duke, it was observed by the vicar, could not stop looking at her. They spent the first 6 months of their marriage in the country, not hiding, though polite London was certain they were hiding. Reading, walking. Eleanor rode a horse for the first time in her life and fell off twice and got back on. The Duke, who had not laughed properly in 10 years, laughed every day. They wrote letters to her father every week. They were, by every account of the servants who attended them, and who would later be interviewed by curious historians, outrageously happy. London waited for the marriage to collapse. London was certain the Duke would tire of her within 6 months and install her in a forgotten country house while he resumed his proper life. London was so certain of this that several of the great hostesses made private bets on the exact date. They all lost their money. Because when, the following spring, the Duke and Duchess of Ashford opened their London house for the first time since their marriage, they did not slink in quietly and hope for acceptance. They did something else entirely. Something that had been, Eleanor later admitted, entirely the Duke's idea, although the execution was entirely hers. They threw a party. The invitations went out in late March. They were written in Eleanor's own hand on cream paper, in a script so elegant that several recipients accused her husband of having hired a secretary. He had not. She had taught herself. The invitations did not go to the great hostesses of Mayfair. They did not go to the patronesses of Almack's. They went instead to a very peculiar and carefully chosen list. They went to Lord Byron, whom Eleanor had never met, but whose poetry she had been reading since she was 15. They went to Mary Shelley, who had published Frankenstein anonymously 2 years earlier, and whom polite society was still pretending did not exist. They went to Sir Humphrey Davy, the chemist. They went to a young and entirely unknown mathematician named Ada, who was the daughter of Byron and who had been told all her life that girls did not do mathematics. They went to a former slave turned orator who was visiting London from the American States and whom no respectable hostess had been willing to receive. They went to a Persian ambassador who spoke 6 languages and who had not been invited anywhere in London for 2 years. And they went, at the very bottom of the list, almost as an afterthought, to one single person from the highest ranks of the ton, His Royal Highness the Prince Regent. Every one of these invitations was accepted. The Prince Regent's acceptance arrived last, and it arrived by special messenger, and it said simply, "I have heard a great deal about the new Duchess of Ashford. I confess I am curious. I shall come." When the great hostesses of Mayfair heard, and they heard within the hour, that the Prince Regent was going to a salon at Ashford House to which they had not been invited, something in the social order of London shifted, quietly but permanently, like a great ship turning in a harbour. The salon took place on a Wednesday in April. It lasted until 4 in the morning. Byron read new poems. Mary Shelley argued about galvanism with Humphrey Davy until Davy conceded, laughing, that she knew more science than half the Royal Society. Ada Byron sat in a corner with a sheet of paper, and when Eleanor came to see what she was doing, showed her the first rough sketch of what she called a machine for thinking. The Prince Regent, who had come prepared to be entertained and perhaps scandalized, stayed for 6 hours, was observed to be in genuine raptures, and upon leaving, kissed the Duchess's hand, and told her, loudly in front of everyone, that she had reminded him of what London used to be before it got dull. By the next morning, Eleanor Ashford was the most talked-about woman in England. And this time, the talk was different. The great hostesses tried at first to freeze her out. It did not work. Because Eleanor, it turned out, had understood something about London society that none of its lifelong practitioners had ever quite grasped. She had understood that power in Mayfair was not, in fact, about bloodlines or titles or the correct ancestors. Power in Mayfair was about being where the interesting people wanted to be. And Eleanor Ashford, quite suddenly, and without anyone noticing how it had happened, was where the interesting people wanted to be. Her Wednesday salons became, within a single season, the most coveted invitation in London. Poets came, scientists came, foreign ambassadors came, young women came, young women who had been told all their lives that their minds did not matter, and who discovered at the Duchess of Ashford's salons that their minds were, in fact, the only thing that did. Several of them went on to publish books. One of them, years later, founded the first women's college in England, and she gave a speech at its opening in which she said, as was carefully recorded, that she owed the existence of her own mind, and therefore of the college itself, to one Wednesday evening in 1819, when the Duchess of Ashford had looked her in the eye and asked her what she really thought. The Prince Regent came to the salons regularly. The great hostesses of Mayfair, who had tried to freeze her out, discovered within 2 years that they were the ones being frozen out. One by one, they swallowed their pride and sent their apologies. Eleanor, who was gracious and who had been raised by a mother who had taught her that kindness is the one weapon that never dulls, received every one of them warmly. None of them were ever quite certain afterward whether they had been forgiven or merely observed. Her father, Thomas Vale, was invited to every salon. He came to most of them. He would sit in a corner quietly with a glass of punch and watch his daughter, the girl he had once thought he had failed by being too poor to give her a proper dowry, command a room that contained 3 earls, a Russian princess, and the future King of England. And on one occasion, a young poet asked Mr. Vale if it was true that the Duchess had once been a merchant's daughter. And Thomas Vale had looked at the young man with a slow, proud smile and said, "She still is, sir, and it is the making of her." London never quite stopped whispering about her. That is the truth, and this story owes you the truth. For the rest of her life, in certain corners of certain drawing rooms, there would always be some elderly dowager who remembered, or claimed to remember, that the Duchess of Ashford had begun her career in a scandal, that she had been found at midnight in the Duke's library, that her father had been, of all dreadful things, in trade. The whispers followed her to the end of her days. But here is the thing about whispers. Whispers only wound you if you are listening for them. And Eleanor Ashford, somewhere in that first terrible fortnight, perhaps in the carriage home after her father found her, perhaps at the country wedding, perhaps at the moment the Prince Regent kissed her hand at her first salon, Eleanor had stopped listening. She had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. She raised all 3 of them to read Latin and to ride horses and to speak their minds in full sentences. And she raised the daughters in exactly the same way as the son, which shocked a number of people and changed, in small and quiet ways, the expectations of a generation of English girls. The son became a reformer in the House of Lords and fought for the expansion of the vote. The elder daughter married for love to a man of modest means, with her mother's full blessing. The younger daughter did not marry at all and became instead one of the first women to publish scientific papers under her own name in England. All 3 children said in later life that the single most important thing they had learned from their mother was this: that the cage is only a cage if you agree to stay in it. The Duke, Julian, adored her until the day he died. He died first, as it happened, of a fever contracted on a trip to Italy they had finally taken together in their 50s. The trip she had dreamed of since girlhood. The trip through the Alps and down to Pompeii. The trip she had once described to him in a letter hidden inside the binding of a book. He died in her arms in a small inn outside Naples. His last words to her, it was said, were, "I have been so lucky. I have been so unfairly, ridiculously, impossibly lucky." She lived 20 more years. She ran her salons until the end. She wrote a memoir, which her family, for reasons of discretion, did not publish until 50 years after her death, and which remains to this day one of the most quietly radical documents of the Regency age. And when she died, at 71, in a sunlit room in the country house where she had spent her first married summer, she was holding, the maid who found her reported, a small green Morocco-bound book of handwritten poems. It was open to the 12th poem, the one about the cage. In the margin, in her own hand, she had written a single line: he was never in it. He only thought he was. Somewhere in the private archives of a university in England, there is a small green Morocco-bound book. It is not on public display. It is rarely asked for. But once or twice a year, a researcher, usually a young woman, usually writing about women's history, will request it, and a librarian will bring it up from the vaults, and she will sit in a quiet reading room and turn the brittle pages by the light of a green-shaded lamp. She will read the 12 poems the Duke wrote about his cage. She will read the marginal note in Eleanor's hand about how he was never in it. And somewhere, tucked between two of the later pages, she will find, because it is still there, pressed flat and brown with age, but whole, a small sprig of rosemary. Rosemary, as any student of Regency flower language knows, means remembrance. That is where the story ends. In a reading room, with a pressed flower, with a woman 200 years later reading the love letters of a girl who was supposed to have been ruined, and a duke who was supposed to have been caged. And understanding, in the sudden, stopped-breath way that certain stories make you understand things, that the bravest thing any of us can ever do is recognize the person who sees us truly, and then refuse, with every ounce of strength we possess, to let them go. Eleanor Vale walked into a library at midnight because she loved books. She walked out of it 14 days later because she had found something rarer than any book in any library in England. She had found a man who read her the way she read her favourite page. Slowly, reverently, and as though each word mattered. And he had found, at last, someone who saw straight through the cage and told him, with merciless tenderness, that he had built it himself. That is the story of the Duke who dared, and the girl who dared back. Thank you for listening tonight here on Moonlight at Mayfair. If this story moved you, stay a moment. There are more like it waiting in the dark. Blow out your candle, pull the quilt a little closer, and remember, the most dangerous thing in any great house is never the ghost. It is always, always the library. Good night.